afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this is a briefing, and so I just wanted to make sure that the folks who are coming from, who are like friends of Harbor Branch, outside of Harbor Branch, who typically come to our ocean science lecture series, this is going to be a little bit different than an ocean science lecture. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is about a study that the National Academy of Sciences recently completed. It's called Sea Change, a 2015-2025 Decadal Survey of Ocean Sciences. And I'm going to go into a little bit of explanation about what the National Academy of Science does, why they do studies, and then get into the meat of the study. So what I hope to, because we have a mixed audience today, we have some of the faculty, staff, students, our long-term supporters, our development folks, the staff here at Harbor Branch. I want to try and make sure that I can tailor it to so that I can address and give you the information that I think might be appropriate for you to have. But if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. What I'd like to do is go through the brief, but if there's something that I say during the brief that's not clear to you, just raise your hand and I'll try and answer it. So it's a little bit different format than the ocean science lecture, the lectures that we have. I have with me today also Dr. Deb Glickson, and Deb doesn't like to be up on the stage. Deb was the study director for this particular study, so she's the one who made it all happen. She's the one who was responsible for corralling all of the committee members. She was responsible for writing huge sections of the report, making sure that we all wrote the sections of the report that we committed to write, and kind of getting it through the review stage. So at the end, if you have any questions, Deb will also help me to answer questions, and she's also here to make sure that I don't say anything that I shouldn't say about, making recommendations that we didn't actually recommend in the report. So, we started on this study about a year and a half ago in September of 2013. And I think the first slide, first slide is about the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council. So the National Research Council, or the NRC, is one arm, one branch of the National Academy of Sciences. And the mission, really, even of the Academy, is to advise the government. So it's not a government organization, it's a nonprofit organization, and it's the go-to organization for objective, independent advice on a variety of topics in science, medicine, and engineering. And the way a study works is that you can, and in fact, they're within the National Research Council, or NRC, there are a number of boards. And so the Ocean Studies Board is the board that was responsible for conducting the study. So the way studies are developed for the National Academy is there are two primary ways. One is that the board itself can identify, the Ocean Studies Board or any of the other boards, can identify a topic that the board thinks needs to have some additional research, some additional advice, that the government should get some advice or an agency should get some advice about this particular topic. And then usually the director of the board will go to a potential sponsor, and the sponsor could be NOAA, National Science Foundation, any one of the mission agencies, or an agency like National Science Foundation, or Congress. Sometimes there are private companies that sponsor studies, but that's not the norm. And then the board director will go talk to this potential sponsor about this study, and then the sponsor may opt to go ahead and sponsor such a study. What's more often the case, I think, is that a potential sponsor will come to the National Academy and say, we would like to have a study done on on priorities for ocean science for the next decade. And at that point, what happens is the sponsor and the director of that board negotiate what's called a statement of tasks. So really clearly defined goals for what it is that you're expected to do for this study. And they have to finance this. It doesn't, we are volunteers, so my time on the Ocean Studies Board studies is supported by FAU, as is the time that's committed by all of the others. We're all volunteers. We're not paid by the National Academy. Our expenses are paid, but our salary is not paid during the time that we do the work. So a statement of task is negotiated, and then after the statement of task is negotiated, a committee is nominated and appointed. And the reason I'm giving you this information is because those of you who are scientists have the opportunity to serve on these committees, because a lot of times there'll be announcements that are put out about a new study that's being done and soliciting nominations. So there are a couple studies that are in the works right now that probably a couple of members of our faculty would be really good nominees. So then the Academy vets all of these. The National Academy vets the nominations and develops a committee. And the committee is composed of diversity diversity in every sense of the word. Okay, so ethnic diversity, gender diversity, scientific disciplines, and so on. And our committee was a committee of 21, so it's a pretty big committee. The committee meets on a regular basis. We met about 7 times during the course from September 2013 till December of last year. And we deliberate. We look at the statement of task, we decide what it is that we have to do, and then we invite input from whatever community is we're serving. So in this particular case, the ocean sciences community. We invited input from experts in the ocean sciences community, from young scientists. You'll see in a minute why I'm saying that. And so the committee meetings are structured in a way that part of them are closed sessions, so the committee deliberates in closed session, but open sessions as well. The open sessions are open to anybody, not just the people we invite to give presentations and provide input. At the end of the information gathering part of the study, we start writing. And that can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. And once the report is written, it's sent out for review. So it's externally reviewed, peer-reviewed, and it's also reviewed by the Academy. And then when the reviews come back, it goes back to the study director and the committee, and we have to respond to all of those reviews. It's a little bit different from when we submit papers for publication, because our responses don't go back to the reviewers or go back to they don't go back to the reviewers. They go back to what's the name of the person at the Academy who does the study? Who's the monitor. So the monitor at the National Academy then reviews all the responses, makes sure that we've addressed the most important reviewer recommendations. And then at that point, it's made public. And usually right before it goes public, the committee, representatives of the committee, brief the sponsor. So in our case, we briefed the National Science Foundation the day before it was published, and we also briefed members of Congress as well, or the staff. Okay, so the context of this report, or this study, was based on the fact that National Science Foundation and OCE, when you see OCE throughout here, it's Ocean Sciences Division within the National Science Foundation. They're the principal supporter, the principal sponsor of oceanographic research, and it's primarily through the Division of Ocean Sciences. The problem is that over the last decade, infrastructure costs, and I'll tell you in a few minutes what we mean by infrastructure. The costs have increased, but there haven't been any increases in funding for NSF, and so that's created a problem because there's an imbalance now between the funds that are being invested in infrastructure and the funds that are being invested to support our scientific research. So NSF wanted to have guidance from an independent, objective group, the National Academy, on how to, first of all, what the priorities for ocean science would be for the next decade, and then how to align the current programs that are in existence right now at NSF, not only in ocean sciences, but throughout NSF, as well as the money that's being invested in infrastructure to support the science. So this was our statement of task. And we're required to stick to that statement of task. We can't, and in fact, one of the functions of our study director is to make sure that when we scientists get in a room and start talking about all the cool things that we could do, in addition to this, that they say, wait a minute, that's not part of the statement of task, that we're not being asked by our sponsor to address this. One example is, we started talking about, education and graduate education. That's not in the statement of tasks, so we really had to stick to that. Our sponsor didn't want our advice on that. Okay, so the first thing we had to do was review what's been going on in ocean science, and specifically NSF ocean science in the last decade. But we could also bring into that some of the exciting discoveries that have happened that have been maybe transformational and would affect ocean science, but that have and funded or conducted in, in other disciplines. So, for example, what happened maybe in medicine that might have an impact on the priorities for the next decade. And then, in my opinion, the most challenging part of this was to come up with what they asked for was a concise set, fewer than 10, compelling, high-level scientific questions for the next decade, which, if answered, could transform the way we look at our oceans. And, there were some other qualifiers on that. Think about things that were ripe for new investment, that were poised to really take off. Then another one the third one was to assess the current ocean infrastructure portfolio. So ships, undersea vehicles, the Ocean Observatories initiative. I'll get into that in a minute. And then the part that was I don't want to say it was the most difficult, but we had a lot of debate on this, and that's what the fun part is about being on these committees. We had to look at the current alignment of investments in ocean science, both the programs, but more especially the infrastructure investments, and consider how they align with the priorities that we had just developed, that we had drafted. And then, the reason I underlined this was what we were told to do. Our task was to do this in the context of no increases in budget. So, aside from inflationary increases, there wasn't going to be any, there weren't going to be any increases in the NSF budget. So we had to deal with what would happen over the next 10 years if we didn't get any more funding at NSF, and how we would balance then. What are the recommendations we're going to give to NSF to balance their budget to make sure that we have a robust ocean science enterprise at the end of the next decade. And then finally, we were asked to identify opportunities for NSF to partner both within NSF, so ocean science to partner with other programs within the National Science Foundation, as well as to partner with other agencies, maybe the private sector, international programs, and so on. I'm not going to go through the whole committee roster. I had the privilege of co-chairing this committee with David Titley. For those of you, I think some of you might know retired Admiral Titley. He was the oceanographer of the Navy. He's currently at Penn State. I have highlighted all of these acronyms here: National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering. We had, I've served on a few of these committees. This was the first committee I served on where we had a lot of Academy members. So we had a lot of, so it actually provides even more kind of credibility, aside from the impressive credentials of the members of the committee, having committee members on, and National Academy committee members on, also increases the credibility of the outcome of the recommendations. As I mentioned before when I introduced Deb Glickson is the Senior Program Officer at the Ocean Studies Board, and she directed this study, and Sue Roberts is the Ocean Studies Board Director. So they were very much involved in this whole process as well. Okay, so just to kind of knock off the first one, looking at the accomplishments, and the report is available right now. It's not published yet, but it's available in electronic form, and you can download it for free from the National Academy website. And the title slide had the web link, but the last slide will also have it. And you can just Google kind of Ocean Studies Board, and you can get to it from that as well. And it's also on the FAU website, I believe. So, basically the Ocean Sciences at NSF has a very strong, successful track record for sponsoring ocean science research with, a lot of outputs, a lot of good publications and transformational research. They've made, pretty good decisions about their basic research investments. They have partnered with other organizations to enhance opportunities to conduct research. And for those of you who have written an NSF proposal in the last few years, you know that a very important part of the evaluation criteria, one important criterion is what's called broader impact. So what are the practical applications of the work that you're proposing to do? What are their direct societal benefits? And so National Science Foundation has done a really good job over the last several years in making sure and ensuring that that the research that it sponsors also includes that the PIs, the principal investigators, know that they have to address broader impacts. Why are you doing this study? Okay, so also I was just asked to remind you, this is not a martini glass, it's a funnel. And so how did we come up with these 8 science priorities? Because it's when you try and think about all the priorities, you can't have 20 priorities or 400 priorities because then you don't have any priorities. You have to have, really narrow it down. So what we did is we were specifically asked to solicit input from the ocean sciences community. So the way we did this was to have a couple of real, what we call town hall meetings at major oceanographic conferences. So we had one at the American Geophysical Union annual meeting in San Francisco in 2013, and then we had another one at the Ocean Sciences meeting, which was in Hawaii, in 2014. But there are many other members of the ocean sciences community who don't participate in those meetings, and so we created on the National Academy website what we called a virtual town hall. So anyone could respond and provide input to a number of questions that we put on a kind of a, I don't want to say a questionnaire, but it was a form that because we didn't want like 20-page dissertations on what should be a priority. So we really wanted to be able to force people to be fairly succinct in their responses. And we had 400 responses to that virtual town hall. In addition to that, we solicited input from what we call early career scientists. If you backed up and looked at that slide of the committee, it's a bunch of people my age. I was going to say old people, but people my age. So I would say mid to late career scientists. So it was really important to us because the decisions, the recommendations we're making are going to affect, students, graduate students, PhD students, and early career scientists. So we wanted to make sure that we heard from early career scientists what they thought was important, what they thought, some challenges that they faced in getting support from the National Science Foundation and in general, ocean science in general. So that was a really important component. We also looked at we had reports that we looked at from National Science Foundation. We had discussions not only with NSF program managers, but with program managers from other agencies. We looked at a number of other National Research Council reports. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There have been a number of other studies recently. So we didn't, want to talk about recommendations for infrastructure where recommendations were there. Similarly, there are been a number of reports both in the U.S. and internationally where priorities for ocean science have already been identified. So we looked at a lot of different, and digested, synthesized all of that information. But I want to tell you that the committee itself really decided on these priorities. So we took under advisement all of the other inputs, but then used a process, a rigid process to winnow down, hundreds of recommendations to a set of about 20 priorities. And then after that, we applied some criteria. What's the potential for it to be transformational? How ready is it to start up? What are societal applications? I'm trying to remember what the fourth one is, Deb. Partnerships, yes, partnership potential. So we looked at each of these with the highest criterion actually being, the most important was transformational. But then we went back and kind of tested that just to make sure that what we got was something reasonable, to make sure that these priorities would really stand up. So it was a rigid process using accepted processes for actually prioritizing, tens or even hundreds of topics. This is the shorthand version of the 8 priorities that the committee drafted. So they do sea level change, coastal and estuarine oceans, ocean and climate variability, biodiversity and marine ecosystems, marine food webs, evolution of ocean basins, characterization of ocean hazards, and the subsea floor environment. The way the report is written, each one of these has a major question, but the way the report is written, we actually go through and identify what other scientific questions need to be addressed to be able to answer the 8 highest priority science questions. And within the report, we also, in each one of these science priority areas, also identify appropriate partners so that you could actually do this. You can address the question not only at NSF, but some ideas about partnerships and how you could do this more effectively in using partnerships. So this was the first. What are the rates, mechanisms, impacts and geographic variability of sea level change? Now, looking at these 8 questions, you might think, especially, some of us, here at Harbor Branch and at Florida Atlantic University, well, none of this stuff applies to the work that I'm doing. Please take a look at the more descriptive narrative on each one of those priorities, because there are a couple in here that, in my opinion, Harbor Branch in particular and Florida Atlantic University in general were particularly poised to address. I think this, in terms of some social science, and for those of you who were at the ocean science lecture last week, not last night, but last week, and talking about sea level change, I think that this is one that Florida Atlantic University is probably poised to address. This is one, I think, again, Harbor Branch would be really well suited to take a look at some of the specific questions relating to coastal and estuarine oceans and their ecosystems, how they're influenced by land use, upwelling from the deep ocean. We're doing some of that work now. How have ocean biogeochemical and physical processes contributed to climate and variability, and how is the system going to change over the next century? So this also has to do with some of the work we're doing in coral reef biology, increasing temperature, decreasing pH. What's the role of biodiversity? I'm going to talk about this one in a little bit more detail in a couple minutes. What's the role of biodiversity and the resilience of marine ecosystems? And how's it going to be affected by changes, both natural and man-made? And this one was one that came up because we had 2 that were more biologically oriented, and we started talking about this because there's a generally accepted, belief that in order for an ecosystem to be resilient to change, it has to be diverse. But we really don't have enough data on that to actually, confirm that. How different are marine food webs going to be in the middle of the century and in the next 100 years? And then the last, and in fact, the way these are organized are not in priority, but the way we kind of organized them in the report was kind of going from the surface of the ocean down to the deep ocean. Processes that control the formation and evolution of ocean basins, characterizing risk and the ability to forecast hazards like mega earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that. And then the geophysical and chemical and biological character of the subsea floor environment. Those of you who may have been following this know that there's been a huge microbial community that's been identified in the subsea floor. We're not talking about the sediments. We know very little about that. And how can a better understanding of that help us to understand more about the origin and evolution of life, not only on this planet, but on other planets as well? So I just want to focus just on one of these, the role of biodiversity and the resilience of marine ecosystems. And we have actually, for each one of these priorities, several questions. So I don't want you to think that these were just the 3 target areas, but I just wanted to show you kind of an example of some of the questions that the committee thought needed to be addressed in order to be able to address this overarching question. So, can we identify and predict triggers for regime shifts in an ecosystem? To what extent is biodiversity going to be affected by each of these, acidification, warming, sea level rise, and so on? And then what organisms have the ability to adapt to change, and how are these ecosystems going to shift as a function of these responses? These are things that we're working on here at Harbor Branch and at Florida Atlantic University. So please pay particular attention to this. Okay, now, why did we even do this in the first place? One of the overarching reasons that we've done this is because over the last, basically since 2013, I think it was, there has been a greater, well, first of all, the thing you want to notice is that aside from the Recovery Act investment, and this reflects a period of time when the idea was that, and the promise was that NSF's budget was going to double over the next decade, and that never happened. And NSF made investments based on the promise that their budget was going to double over the next decade. And then we had the kind of slug of money from the Recovery Act, and even more investments were made in infrastructure. And we found ourselves then at a point in time where, I think in 2011 it was, the budget actually started decreasing. The funding to the National Science Foundation Ocean Sciences actually decreased. And the blue line is the funding that's going to the science programs, and the orange line is the funding going to infrastructure. And in 2013, those lines crossed. And what happened was that more money was being invested in support of infrastructure and less in support of the science programs. And considering a level budget, no funding increase, this is going to persist basically, for the next several years. And so now we have a situation where we've got about a $40 million difference between funding for programs and science programs and funding for infrastructure. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. If anybody's interested, I can go back. This is just a breakdown in ocean sciences in the different disciplines. So again, if we take a look at this crossover, in 2000, 62% of the budget was going to science. Right now, it's more like 46%. So it's not good. And just to place this into context, this kind of would account for, let's just say it were equal, say 50%. That, say $20 million, if you assume that an NSF project is maybe $200,000 a year, that $20 million would fund another 100 projects. So that makes a big difference. Okay, so what we are calling major infrastructure are things, facilities, that cost more, that NSF spends more than $5 million a year on. There are many other pieces of infrastructure that NSF supports, but the committee decided early on that we didn't really want to focus on the little stuff because it's not going to have a major impact. We really need to look at the facilities, the infrastructure that cost more than $5 million, and some of them cost substantially more than $5 million a year. So the three primary ones were the academic research fleet, so what we all know as UNOLS. The annual budget, 2014 budget was $83 million. It's about that, anywhere from $75 to $85 million is what NSF invests in paying for ship time on NSF projects. The Scientific Ocean Drilling Program, which is called the International Ocean Discovery Program, it's about $50 million a year just to operate and maintain that. And if you see O&M in here later on, O&M means operations and maintenance. The Ocean Observatory's initiative, which hasn't really even been implemented yet, they're still in the construction phases. You're going to start implementing that soon, like I think maybe this month, next month? Okay, by June, fully implemented by June. And we're not really, the budget estimates for operation and maintenance of the Ocean Observatory's initiative is between $55 and $59 million a year. And then the National Deep Submergence Facility, those of you who know that, that's the facility that provides support for Alvin, Jason, so on. That's about $7 million a year. These four things comprise more than 90% of the annual infrastructure budget. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, Clay. Well, it wouldn't be, I don't think it's from, it's not OI because they're still in MRE of SAVE. Deb, do you want to? Probably from this increased, this increased.
It's actually for a number of reasons. One is that there are some new ships that came online.
Right.
So the academic research fleet had a couple new ships. There was a refit of the drill ship, and that led to higher costs overall in the last couple of years.
And there was an Alvin refit that cost $40 million.
But that's not in this line.
It's not?
No.
Are you sure it's not in the program? It wasn't out of the program.
Oh,
no, it wasn't in the, came out of their program budget. Never mind.
But so it's basically stuff is coming online and nothing has been taken offline. And costs are just increasing. Crew costs, fuel costs were up until this year. So that's what's been responsible.
Right. Right. That's the problem. It's coming online, and now we're going to, it's going to be another, $50 to $60 million, hit.
Right. And when you look at those lines that they were showing us that had the totals of infrastructure and science, they're held constant once you hit 2015 to 2019. They were flat. That may or may not be polite fiction. We don't know that that's going to stay flat.
So the way what we wanted to do was to be able to say, okay, out of these facilities, how do they align with the priorities that the committee identified? It doesn't mean they don't align with other core science programs within ocean sciences, but we were specifically tasked with identifying how the current infrastructure aligns with the priorities that we identified. So we did this in two different ways. First, we looked at the science priority, and we matched the science priority with the existing infrastructure. And then we also looked at gaps that weren't available through ocean sciences. And then the other was that we looked at the infrastructure components, their specifications of the infrastructure, to see, and the goals of those programs to see how they matched to the science priorities. And this matching was not just done, by the committee on what we knew. We actually went back, looked at program goals, science plans, reports, and also the VTH's video town hall input as well. Okay, so what we found was that the global, there are 4 classes of ships in the UNOLS fleet. So there's global class, ocean class, intermediate class, and regional class. And so for those of you who remember when we had the Seward Johnson and the Edwin Lake, I believe they were both intermediate class. I could be wrong, but I think they were both intermediate class. Regional ships are like the Walton Smith at the University of Miami. What we found, what the committee determined, again, from review, based on our deliberations as well as looking at the priorities and the science plans, was that the global ships were critical or important for all of the science priorities, and there was an increasing demand for the global ships. The problem is that many of these global ships are going to come offline because of their lifetime expectancy within the next decade. And so there's going to be a shortage of one of the assets that we believe we need the most. The regional ships were considered to be critical or important for many of the coastal questions, so some of the priorities that we had in coastal. And then ice-capable ships are critical or important for the polar oceans, obviously. Now, what RCRV is a regional class research vessel. Right now, there's a plan to build 3 new regional class research vessels, and this is just a cartoon of the picture of what it might look like. What the committee was concerned about is that because we scientists, not we scientists on the committee, but we scientists in the ocean science community were able to provide input into what we thought was needed on the regional class research vessel. And we have what we called capability creep. So these regional class research vessels now that are being designed are actually more like intermediate vessels. And it also, what the implication of that is that they're costing more too. So any of the algorithms that we use for projecting out how much things are going to cost over the next 10 years are going to be skewed because these research vessels are not going to cost they're going to cost more than what the regional ships cost today. So, you know, we found that they have a lot higher day rates. They had better capabilities than the current regionals, but they were still geographically limited in their range. So we were really concerned about the current design, and they're in the design plans right now. Is the current design matched to future use? And the current plan, although NSF hasn't requested money from what's called a Major Research Facilities Program, they haven't requested funding for that. But the plan is to request funding for 3 of them. And so the question was, do we really need 3? Can we do 2? You know, maybe build a 3rd later. Maybe a partner wants to contribute to that. Because each one you build is going to cost way more than 2 regional ships that it might replace. For the International Ocean Discovery Program, we found that the capabilities of the drill ship were really critical to some of the priorities, the evolution of ocean basins, geohazards, the subsea floor biosphere, and it's also important for sea level rise and climate variability priorities. But the United States pays the bulk of the cost for the drill ship. And so the committee was recommending, and I'll go through the recommendations in a few minutes, that it looks like the international community as a whole is kind of overextended in what they're spending for the drilling program internationally, not only the U.S. component, but internationally, because there are a couple of other drill ships as well that are even more expensive than the JOIDES resolution. The Ocean Observatories initiative consists of 3 components. Well, 4 counting the cyber infrastructure. I was like, I know it's 4 components, but I only see 3 up there. Okay, so there's a cabled observatory that exists off of the west coast of the U.S. We found that, you know, that could address topics in ocean basin evolution, geohazards, and subsea floor biosphere. We found the coastal arrays would be important, and these are arrays that are both on the east and west coast for addressing priorities related to sea level change, coastal processes, and climate variability and impacts. And there are 4 global moorings that were important for climate variability. But you'll notice it just says important. We didn't find that it was critical infrastructure for any of the science priority questions that we identified. And that's a problem because it's a it's a big component of the infrastructure expenses. So what we did is we kind of put them on kind of like this little diagram where we looked at relevance, so lower relevance, higher relevance, and cost, lower to higher. So, obviously things that are higher relevance and lower cost are really good. But what we found, this quadrant here was the quadrant of greatest concern if you're thinking about budgets. And what we found was that the Ocean Observatory's initiatives components and what it's going to cost for operation and maintenance fell into this quadrant where, in terms of relevance to the priorities, they were of lower relevance. The coastal and cabled observatories were more relevant than the global, but their cost was high. On the other hand, we found that ships were highly relevant, and they also, have high costs. But field stations, we found, were higher relevant, but low cost. Okay, so and the reason these have an asterisk because I think the cost didn't include ship time on that. So if you included ship time, it would go up a little bit more as well. So these assessments of relevance and cost were based on how the committee thought they aligned with the priorities. So just to remind you, course corrections are necessary now, okay? So we start thinking about what's critical, what's important. Oh, by the way, I wanted to just go back and show you. Oh, yeah, I talked about field stations, never mind. Okay, so we came up with a series of 7 recommendations. Okay, the first had to do with fiscal planning. And so what happens now that for these National Academy reports, when you make a recommendation, it carries a fair amount of weight. That's what, your sponsor is looking at. All the rest of it is kind of, supporting information and providing some guidance, but the recommendations are the things that carry some weight. So you have to be really, we have to be very, deliberate about the recommendations that we made. So the first was in order to sustain a robust ocean science community by the end of the next decade, you have to do fiscal planning. You have to plan. Take a look at the whole picture, not just, we got a windfall this year because of the Recovery Act. Now we can invest $400 million in building these components of the system, but kind of think about what's the long-term, what's the long-term plan for that. And to maintain that focus on sustaining the core research programs, especially during a flat budget or declining budgets, because as Deb mentioned, that we just assumed a flat budget. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to get the same that we got last year at the National Science Foundation. So the committee recommended that infrastructure expenses should not be allowed to escalate at the expense of the core science programs. So the second recommendation was you have to rebalance the budget. The budget has to be rebalanced. You have to reduce the operating and maintenance costs of the major infrastructure, and for that we looked specifically at the three major components. So the Ocean Observatories Initiative, the drill ship, really, and the academic research fleet, and restore funding to core science and what's called OTIC, Oceanographic, and interdisciplinary collaboration, oceanographic technology and interdisciplinary cooperation or collaboration. So OTIC is a really cool program, and over the last few years, it's suffered. It went, I think, maybe a $12 million annual budget down to about $1 million. That's where you apply for kind of, innovative technology development. And so the committee felt strongly that NSF not only had to cut the funding to these other programs, but put the money into cut the money to the infrastructure, but put the money back into the programs. And we were deliberate about calling out OTIC as well. And if budgets this one's really important. If budgets remain flat or they have only inflationary increases, the budget should be adjusted so that the major infrastructure programs comprise no more than 40 to 50% of the total budget. We arrived at that based on some dialogue we had with the National Science Foundation Ocean Sciences interim director, and her name's Debbie Bronk, and she was talking about a year that she thought was a good year where it was a really robust program, good funding for science, good funding for the infrastructure. And during that year, and I believe that was 2011, it was a 50-50. It was about a 50-50 split. Okay, how are we going to do this? So this was the part that was really interesting to do. Ocean Sciences, National Science Foundation has to initiate, we're recommending that they initiate an immediate, and we're talking about the next budget, 10% cut in major infrastructure costs, and that has to be followed by another 10 to 20% decrease over the following 5 years. Okay, so think about that. If somebody said to you, you have to cut your budget 10% next year, and oh, by the way, in years 2, 3, 4, and 5, it needs to be cut another 10 to 20%. And again, reiterating, it needed to go directly into strengthening core science programs, the science priorities, technology development, and funding partnerships. One of the things we've heard from our from the young scientists, our early career scientists, was, how do we do interdisciplinary studies? How do we partner up? And so we really want to be able to encourage the early career scientists to be able to do that. But the ultimate goal was to rebalance the budget. Okay, so how do we do that? Because we knew that we couldn't just say, you have to go and make the cuts. This report would sit on the desk and just say, fine, there's no way we're going to be able to do that. It's not going to happen. So the committee recommended that the greatest reduction had to be applied to OOI. And that was based on community input, but it was also based on what the committee determined, again, based on a number of reports about how critical it was to the ocean sciences priorities. It was important, but it wasn't critical. You could use other things to answer those questions. A more moderate reduction to the drilling program, and the smallest reduction to the academic research fleet. We still need to go out to sea. What we suggested was to immediately reduce OOI by 20%, IODP by 10%, and the UNOS fleet by 5%. We provide in the report some suggestions for how to do that. For example, OOI could immediately reduce their operation and maintenance costs by 20% if they cut out 2 of the global arrays, the global moorings. So we're not saying you have to do that, but we're suggesting how to do that. And by the way, we did also look at other scenarios. What if we just cut the programs completely? What if we just cut them completely? Because, you could realize that initial cost reduction and the longer term reduction if you just cut out some of the programs. The committee decided that really wasn't first of all, it wasn't the way we wanted to go. OOI is just coming online and really hasn't had the opportunity to really support some of the science programs. Plus, we found it to be critical to addressing some of the science priorities. So, same thing with IODP and the UNOLS fleet. Okay, in terms of the regional class research vessels, we recommended that the foundation reconsider whether or not the current regional class research vessel design is aligned with the scientific needs. If it's cost effective, because it's going to cost more than the current regional class vessels, and consider whether or not they really need to build 3 regional class research vessels right now. And in terms of how we provide some guidance for this over the long term, the committee recommended periodic program reviews. So that some of these programs actually have reviews within the programs, but what we're recommending is that at the NSF level, NSF look at these infrastructure programs on a periodic basis, every 3 to 5 years, looking out for 10 years, and consider if there are exit strategies, if in fact, these assets are not really critical to addressing the priorities. And of course, NOC is really good about that, getting periodic community input to make sure that the investments that they're making in infrastructure really do align with the community's science priorities. And there should be an oversight committee within NSF to evaluate that entire portfolio of the ocean sciences supported infrastructure. And the important thing here, again, kind of looking out over the next 10 years, is it should include people who are experienced in long-range budgeting and strategic planning. That may not necessarily be, a group of scientists, okay? It has to be people who have this experience in budget planning and strategic, budget planning and strategic investments as well. And then finally, we encourage the Ocean Sciences program at NSF to expand partnership capabilities with other federal agencies and the international sector. And the whole idea of this is to help spread the costs of some of this infrastructure, because there are other agencies that are using similar, or even in some cases the same infrastructure. So how can we maximize those partnership opportunities? So, the final thoughts were that NSF needs to, and again, we're making recommendations to NSF. They can take them. They don't have to take them. They paid the National Academy to address some of the issues that they wanted guidance on. We addressed that statement of task and provided the recommendations back to them. It's up to them to decide if they're going to act on those recommendations. We believe that they need to take immediate action. They need to set some strategic boundaries and have a long-term plan to maintain that balance so they don't drift away from that channel where you have that kind of 50-50 support, or 60% support for science programs and 40% for infrastructure. The report was released on January 23rd. We've already briefed staffers in D.C. and appropriate committees in the Senate and House and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We've done something that's kind of unusual for at least any of the NRC studies I've been involved in. We're actually going out to universities, research institutions, oceanographic research institutions around the country. We first started where we were just going to go to the institutions from which the members of the committee came, and then decided that since we're doing that, we should really try and reach as many other institutions as we can, and especially if they're in the geographic area. So, for example, tomorrow we're going to be going down to Miami There was nobody on the committee from Miami, but we're going down tomorrow to Miami to do a briefing there. Yesterday we were at University of South Florida. One of the members of our committee, Steve Morowski, is from South Florida. We're going to have a public webinar on March 11th, and information on that is at this website. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, Deb and I would be happy to answer them. Yeah, Jim.
What's the cost for one of the ballpark for one of the regional classes?
The annual, the construction cost, was it like 40? I think it was like, we actually don't have that information because it's still in the design phase. It's still in the design phase. Yeah. See, she's doing her job here. She's making me not answer that question because we didn't have the information to answer that. I could kind of ballpark it, but I'm not going to.
What class vessel is necessary to service the OOI?
Okay, so the question was what class vessel is necessary to service the OOI? Different ones. So the coastal ones can go like with more regional or intermediate class, but the global arrays need global class ships. Yeah, Valerie.
What's at the meetings like this that you've been to so far? What's the reception been for the rest?
What's the reception been to the recommendations? It varies, as you can imagine. So for example, if I were giving this presentation at an organization that was highly vested in OOI or IODP, I'm not going to say it's going to be hostile, but there would be more questions about it. Right. But I would say that in general, we've gotten really positive responses, both in the, in fact, it's interesting because yesterday one of the folks in the audience said, why didn't you make bigger cuts to OOI? Because the committee felt, we justify, with the recommendations. But I would say, Valerie, in general, the response has been good. And when we presented this to the National Science Foundation, again, they were very pleased with the report. There's a new director of ocean sciences at National Science Foundation. His name is Rick Murray, and he just started. So for a new program director, a new ocean sciences division director coming in and having kind of some coming in, inheriting a budget that's out of whack, and having a National Academy Committee provide some recommendations on how he might be able to get it back in place is a good thing. So the timing worked out, really well. And that's because Deb kept us on track as well. Yes, sir.
Give us some idea of the private-public partnership potential and where that might be.
Yeah, we didn't really spend a lot of time in the study actually looking at like specific private-public partnerships, but some of the things, like for example, some of the in terms of like the drilling program, that would be an area where public-private partnerships might be established to help with with some of that field work. So that's one example. Okay. Yes.
Dr. Pomponi, my question pertains to OOI, and it was in context of the relationship that your findings could have with NOAA's
the eyes.
Big commitment to OOI generally, particularly the GOES.
Right. So NOAA's program that would be another area that would be good for partnership, quite frankly. But it's a completely separate program. So the International Integrated Ocean Observing System with NOAA is a completely separate program.
Well, then your comment about partnering leads in the direction of what I had in mind, that is it possible that there's potential for dual use of what's collected from there?
Yeah. So really good example of that's already been in place, and is the Argo float system. So the Argo floats is a very successful program where these floats are deployed, worldwide, and I think they're under the they're run by NOAA, right? Does NOAA do Argo? Yeah, NOAA runs the Argo floats, the operation and maintenance of the Argo floats, but the data are available. Yeah.
So subsidiary
the reason that they got a surge in funding, it came out of a different account to build the components. So they got about $400 million, right? Isn't it about $400 million? I think it was from the Recovery Act, right? Part of it was from the Recovery Act. So to actually build the components. And this goes back a long way because there was a community workshop that was held in, I don't know, 2000? Before that. It was before that. Do you remember, Clay, when the OOI community workshop was held? It was a long time ago. And then from that, this program grew, and there were champions for this program, and there are many different components. And the major oceanographic institutions are involved in this.
So that was kind of a process of a disconnect between enthusiasm to build versus utility and the application.
Yeah, you want to address that?
Not because Shirley said anything wrong. I heard you laughing. But it's actually that, so they're totally different accounts in terms of how you build versus how you pay for it after the build. And at the time that they decided to do OOI, budgets were going up. It seemed like it was a good program. You know, people were fairly enthusiastic about it, just like we are for ships, just like we are for ocean drilling. But as time went on, when they moved into their construction phase, when they started thinking about what they were really going to be building, they didn't engage the community anymore. And so then you kind of lost the interest for the broad community. And now, as this is going to be coming online, it's a 25-year program, so you have to pay over $50 million a year to keep paying for it. You know, every single year for 25 years, there's no community really that there's a very small community, I should say, that wants to be involved in it. Yeah, it really does. And it's true for all of the pieces. A lot of this stuff, it's not really NSF's fault. A lot of this stuff came online when budgets were looking much, much better. And now they're not. And so you have to kind of figure out, do we want to keep the money in the science so that we can have flexibility to do the programs we want, or do we want to keep supporting just, paying for the infrastructure that we have?
Yeah, Laurent?
So regional one is kind of realize the
Mm-hmm.
What about looking at the entire? So basically, what program of extent do you judge that you do support what you already required?
Because we weren't tasked to do that. That's the short answer. You know what, Laurent? We didn't even look at that. We didn't even look. That would have been one, like if we started talking about that, Sue and Deb would have said, that's not part of our statement of tasks. You have to stick to the statement of tasks. So we really didn't even discuss that. What we talked about was how could some of these expenses be shared among some of the other directorates, because they do, some of the other directorates within NSF do benefit from these facilities. So is there some way they could be shared? But to tell you the truth, that didn't even enter, I don't even think that even entered into our recommendations as well. So we were really looking at, because we made the assumption that, we can't go targeting other directorates. We were specifically tasked with how you balance the budget within ocean sciences. Yeah, Megan. Yeah, so we didn't look at the infrastructure and how it's addressing like the current science, what's going on right now. We just didn't have the data for that. However, we did have a matrix that we developed, and it was admittedly subjective. It was admittedly subjective, and I think I actually even have that. It's probably all the way at the end. That. Yeah, we did all that too. I have that just in case he has. This was the matrix that we put. So along the top are the 8 science priorities, and then this was the academic research fleet. This is IODP, so the drill ship. This was OOI, the different components of OOI. This was the National Deep Submergence Facility, and then we also included some other things in there. And then this was kind of in that other category where it was kind of like less than $5 million a year, but the committee wanted to take a look at how, so for example, you look at field stations and marine labs, you see that they're critical for addressing, a few of these questions as well. And then you can't read this, but if you look at the report, you'll be able to see it. We also looked at other critical or important infrastructure assets. So these are ones that are not only in NSF, but in other, other agencies or at universities and so on. So other assets that could be brought to bear to address these questions. So that weren't part of the infrastructure at NSF right now, but that exist and could be used. Amy.
So I have a question, two questions. First, was anyone in the OOI community on this committee?
Yes. So nobody, wasn't Charlie, isn't Charlie? No, Charlie's ODP. And it wasn't, yeah, go ahead.
So we didn't have any people who were active proponents of OOI,
Right.
and that's because it's still in the planning phase. All those people are getting money. They're all, financially related to OOI right now. Instead, what we tried to do was get a couple of people who had been involved in OOI in earlier stages, didn't have a financial involvement, but so they could talk about, the history. And then we really tried to reach out to them to understand what was going on, both at NSF
Right.
and then with the people who are actively involved with OOI.
So we had an entire session, one of our meetings, that was devoted to input from OOI.
And then my next question is now that they receive this, can they look at the tools that we invested $400 million, I think that's the number
Right.
to build, and say, can any of those be repurposed over to be addressing one of these things?
Right.
So we didn't waste.
Right, so that's a really good question. And if you notice, we're not suggesting that they're cutting kind of the coastal array or the cabled array. 2 of the 4 global arrays. So even though global moorings, even those aren't going to be, no pun intended, sunk costs, because you'd still have those components that could be used, because you're going to have, breakdown. You're going to. So you still have components that could be used for the other 2 arrays. So we're not actually wiping out any of the 3 components, but we're and the 2 that we're suggesting are the ones that are, in the Southern Ocean that are pretty far away. So those are ones that, it's a very good question. So, because we actually considered that. We considered there may be contracts in place. There may be, vendors that still have to, that type of thing. So we really we thought a lot. I would say that we probably spent the most time talking about how exactly to do this.
But I would contend that the Southern Ocean, if you believe John Englander, might actually be important.
But maybe not where, but Amy, maybe not where those arrays were.
Yeah, maybe not.
And that was the issue. So, and the thing is that they don't have to, they don't have to cut those 2. They don't have to cut any of them. The OOI community now needs to decide, and that program now needs to decide, and more importantly, NSF needs to decide first what it's going to do. NSF is going to have to provide guidance and say, these are the cuts that are going to be made. You guys come back and tell us where that. And yep, Deb, did you want to?
We also suggested that NSF start looking towards international partnerships for some of those moorings, because they're really far away from us. So why isn't Chile helping, to do O&M on some of these? And so I think it's important for us, to show that we had options beyond just cutting things. It was, how do you get other communities engaged, whether that's international, whether it's other federal agencies, if they see value. It can't all be supported by NSF at this time.
Yeah, Larry?
First, thank you for your involvement in this. We're very proud that you're involved in this.
Thank you.
Second, just to this, do we have any sense of when we're going to see some response from NSF to these recommendations? Is it sort of roll out, or?
We don't have a sense of when that's going to happen, but we hope it's going to happen in the next budget. But I'm sure that we're going to be having some meetings and involvement with NSF. I know that Rick Murray has asked to be involved in the webinar on March 11th, so you might want to ask him that when he's there on the webinar. I'm sure somebody will ask that. But no, I mean, really, once we deliver the report, provide briefings, basically that's it. And I will say that, a number of these reports have, I think I may have mentioned this at the beginning, I don't know if I did it today or if it was yesterday, but a lot of these reports end up really affecting decisions that Congress makes about appropriations as well. And we've briefed some of the committees on the Hill about the outcomes of this report, the recommendations. Yeah, Clay.
Yeah, Shirley, I was just second Larry's comments.
Thank you.
The fact that so much OCD money tied up in these big chunks makes it, you all like NSF only greenhouse companies.
Yeah.
And, if the program director, you stop. A big chunk of a big budget is already committed. And if some of that can be freed up, it's more projects.
And the thing is, too, is that if they really are, if they're conscientious about this, it's going to be more like a 40 million. I mean, it's the initial 10% cut, but another 10 to 20% cut, which would equate to something like $40 million. Now you're talking about 200 more $200,000 grants each year. That's huge. That's a lot. That makes a huge difference. It, really, the success rate is a lot better. Okay, yeah, Gail?
So, just to ask you, I'm impressed the fact you started off by saying that you were not paid for this, right? That you were volunteers.
Harbor Branch paid me for it. Yes, but we're volunteers. We're volunteers for the National Academy.
I mean, I'm very, very admired. But how much time did you say that you put in?
More than what I got paid for. I think most of us who work here do that anyway, so. We started in September. Well, in this co-chair, it involves a little bit more work as well. So we started in September of 2013, so it's been going on for about, 18 months. And I still have, a few more briefings, but I enjoy doing this. I mean, I wouldn't do it if I didn't think it was important, and I enjoy doing it. And the university is, the university is supportive of this effort too. Yeah. Okay. Yep. One more.
The question pertaining to the research vessel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is speaks to the issue of partnering as well. But I realize that drill ships and ice capable or they're specialized, but platforms that are not so specialized, is it possible to perhaps get maybe decommissioned?
Question has to do with this whole issue with ships and some ships that are more specialized than others, and maybe getting Navy more involved. I will tell you that the Navy has already said they're not going to be building it because Navy has right. You're right. Navy has built ships for the ocean sciences community. They paid for ships to be built. Go ahead.
In fact, almost all of the global ships, the big ships, are owned by Navy.
Right.
So Navy is an active participant in the academic research fleet. However, the big change is that they're not going to be paying for the biggest ships anymore. They don't see, they don't want to commit to continuing to pay for the academic research fleet. So. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So we have been exploring, and we don't talk about it too much in this report, but we've talked about it in previous reports that National Research Council has done about other fleets. The NOAA has a very big fleet. So, we have talked about how you could better leverage other ships that are owned by the federal family. But no, just so everyone is clear, Navy has a huge investment in these ships thus far. They've been a great partner with NSF.
Thanks, Deb. Clay?
One quick comment in reference to the last question.
Uh-huh. I saw you laughing at that. Not laughing, smiling.
Yeah, that's a big, big question, right? It involves the Office of Management's budget, it involves the National Science Board,
And now start talking about trying to develop partnerships between agencies when you have that much trouble kind of moving monies around within departments, within a single agency, and think about the challenges of creating partnerships across agencies. It's really been a challenge. Yeah, Amy? Yep.
So as you were doing all this discussion, in other agencies like NIH, sometimes we have big, love to get a big project like HBOI, but we never have that much money. But
if only.
Did you talk about you talk about these $200,000 a year grants, but did you talk about them developing bigger? We're talking about big questions like climate change and whatever. Bigger projects where you're integrating people in, or you want a bunch of $200,000.
So no, and in fact, we don't. This whole kind of like example of what a $40 million thing would buy isn't even in the report. That wasn't. It was just one of our committee members said, well, the way that we can maybe translate that into what it means for why should you care? Why should a young scientist care? Why should a graduate student who looks at this and says, oh my God, there's not going to be any money for me. Why am I even staying in this field? That's how we kind of put that together. But to answer your question, we really didn't spend time on talking about kind of like programs that NSF could invest in. We looked at kind of larger questions, many of which incorporate climate change, impacts of climate change, and you'll see that in the report as well. But it was interesting because when we went through it was an interesting process that we used to come up with the priorities, and we looked at all different ways to do that, and we were thinking about, well, should we talk about topics like climate change, like 3 or 4 things, or then we should talk about it by discipline. No, we don't want to do it by discipline because we really want to encourage interdisciplinary research, and that was one of the things that the early career scientists said was important to them, but that they felt that they were being discouraged by NOAA program officers from doing that. And when we talked to NOAA program officers about that, NSF program officers about that, they were surprised that they, because So anyway, we actually recommend, I'm not sure if it was a recommendation, but in the report that the early career scientists, really should be encouraged. Well, we should all be encouraged to do more interdisciplinary research. We wanted to try and get away from just strictly disciplinary research. Yep. Any other questions? I want to thank you all for coming. This is a really mixed audience, and I'm really pleased to see that we have so many members of our community here. And I hope that this presentation, although it was different than one of our science lectures, has given you some insights about what we as scientists are faced with in terms of, like thinking about strategies for our research, how we fund our research, and the opportunities we have at higher levels to make an impact on how agencies fund our research as well. And for those of you at Harbor Branch, especially the faculty and the students and the staff, but I also want to thank the members of the staff who aren't science staff who also came today, because I hope it gives you an idea of kind of the types of things that we're challenged with as well. Like when, you just say our budgets or something and then you don't know what we all had to go through to get to it. So thanks all for coming, and I'll be up here for a few minutes more if anybody has any other questions. So thank you very much.